In this video, I'm going to show you all things wrong with the MMP turbo. The tolerances for the piston ring seal all measured 14 thousandths on both plates, but the actual tolerance is supposed to be 3 thousandths gap on the piston ring. So I had to make these inserts and machine the plates and then press in the inserts to correct the tolerance. I machined it back out to the correct dimension so that we now have a 3 thousandths gap on the piston rings on the front. On the rear, we got 14 to 15 thousandths gap on the piston rings on the rear, which it's actually supposed to be, normally on a turbo it's supposed to be 2.5 thousandths, so we're aiming for 2.5 to 3 thousandths gap on the rear piston rings. The issue with the gap being so big on these is that it can easily leak oil from the gap being too big because the ring is not compressing enough to keep the oil inside of the cartridge and to keep the exhaust gases outside of the cartridge. The other issue that's a pretty big one is this pin was too short to reach the ball bearing cage, so it was not retaining the cage in the location that it's supposed to be, so the compressor, the whole assembly could move all the way over and hit the compressor housing. Another issue was the diameter where the pin goes in. It's not tight enough to retain the pin to keep it in, so the pins just fell out. The last problem that I think is an issue, but there's nothing I could do about it, and it really doesn't really matter as much, is the tip height or the radius clearance from here to the compressor housing is off by about 25 thousandths too deep on the cover, and the only way to correct that is really to make another plate here and move it back in, and I'd have to basically where it's flat here, I'd have to have this come out a little bit on the edge so that the C-clip would still work, but that's a lot more work than I think it's worth. The radius tolerance doesn't matter as much as the inducer. The main objective of when this is machined is to prevent air from escaping and to allow it to compress. So you want the wheel to be as close to the compressor housing as possible without touching, but it matters most on the inducer right here rather than the radius. But I always try to make everything exactly perfect as possible, as if it's from the OEM specs. But because that's off, I mean, I don't think that's really a big deal. I'm just trying to fix them so they'll actually work. The compressor wheel is a regular 19T billet compressor wheel, so that's readily available. The piston ring for the front and rear are both GT35R. The turbine shaft is a 35R size. This shaft size right here, that's actually going to be TD04, so it's a custom shaft, but where it fits on the bearing cage, that's machine spec to a 28R to a 35R spec. The turbine shaft's completely, or the wheel's completely a custom turbine. Alright, stay tuned if you want to see this get put together. I've already fixed both plates. One cartridge is done, besides this pin can still move, so we're going to have to figure out how to retain this from moving over. We made new pins, made them longer so they'll reach down to the bearing cage, tighten up the clearance between the cage and the pin so that's not going to move as much as it did before. So now I'm just going to most likely take a punch and then punch the side of this so that the pin cannot physically move over. This part I'll make a video of how this gets replaced right here, because we got to sleeve that. Alright, stay tuned if you want to see more.